Welcome to Suburbia, 1957. Step inside. Not just into a house, into an entire world. A world where the lawns are too green, the smiles too bright, and the silence between words carries more weight than any argument ever could. This isn't nostalgia. This is memory, polished to a high shine and sealed beneath layers of linoleum, canned ham, and unspoken dread. Before you settle in, go ahead and dim the lights. Pour yourself something strong, maybe a martini if you're feeling rebellious, or weak coffee if you're playing the part. Turn on a fan. Let that low, steady hum fill the room like the background radiation of a generation trying not to scream. Get comfortable, preferably on a couch that's slightly too short for your legs. One that smells faintly of cigarette smoke, furniture, polish, and generational trauma, because tonight, we're not just remembering the 1950s, we're living inside it. You've just woken up in the suburbs of America at the height of its so-called golden age. Beneath your feet, cold linoleum, gleaming from yesterday's battle with bleach and elbow grease. In the pantry, Wonder Bread, orange juice from a can, and enough Spam to last through 3 nuclear winters. Outside, the neighbors' hedges are trimmed so straight they'd make a drill sergeant weep with pride. The TV murmurs softly in the corner, broadcasting some wholesome program about families who never argue and dogs who always save the day. You have strong opinions about margarine now, and surprise your true feelings. They stay buried 6 inches under the surface, right where they belong. This is the American dream, freshly pressed and starched within an inch of its life. But look closer. Behind every perfectly aligned spoon drawer and vacuum track in the carpet, there's something darker, pulsing, not evil, not exactly, but a deep, quiet unease. A sense that everything is held together by sheer willpower, hairspray, and the silent agreement that no one will ever ask, "Are we okay?" Let's begin with breakfast. Breakfast isn't a meal here. It's a performance. A pageant staged daily in kitchens lit with the sterile glow of fluorescent bulbs. Your mother appears before dawn, already wearing lipstick, just in case the postman sees her. She moves like a soldier on patrol, wiping down countertops, checking toast, reciting reminders about shoes, lunch money, and how nice it would be if someone, anyone, remembered to put their socks in the hamper at the table. The children sit in pajamas, eyes still heavy with sleep, but already being judged for posture, for enthusiasm, for whether they chew with their mouths closed. The food itself is ambitious in ways that defy logic. Bananas that have known better days, apples waxed to a mirror shine, toast pre-buttered and cut into triangles, as if geometry could somehow improve flavor, and the cereal. Oh, the cereal. These aren't granola blends or oat milk fantasies. No, these are sugar bombs, poured from boxes adorned with cartoon mascots whose sole purpose is to hook you on marshmallows before 3rd grade. Milk splashes onto the plastic tablecloth, the kind that feels more like a raincoat than fabric, and no one says a word. There's a pecking order, of course. Dad sits at the head of the table, scanning the newspaper like he's being tested on global affairs. Kids line up by age and emotional stability, each angling for the butter dish like it's the Holy Grail, and Mom, she's everywhere at once, refilling juice, adjusting collars, reminding you not to slouch. Every moment is Say, please. Say thank you. Keep your elbows off the table. Speak only when spoken to. Complain about the eggs. You'll get a lecture about starving children in Europe. Linger too long. You'll be hustled out the door with a lunchbox and a reminder that the early bird catches the worm, as if worms were something to aspire to. And yet, for all the choreography, there's a strange comfort in this routine, a sense that, for this brief window, the world is exactly as it should be. There's no Instagram, no phones, no endless scroll of other people's lives. Just the promise of Saturday morning cartoons and the quiet certainty that tomorrow you'll do it all over again. But the pageant ends quickly. Dad vanishes into his land yacht of a car, merging into a river of identical Fords heading downtown. Kids scatter to buses, and Mom faces the wreckage alone, a stack of plates, the scent of burnt toast, the faint echo of voices that already feel like ghosts. Then she begins again, because being a 1950s housewife isn't a job, it's an endurance sport, and the only thing higher than the standards is her caffeine intake. She follows a sacred schedule taped to the inside of every cabinet door, a document so precise it could pass for military code. Vacuuming has rules. Resting has consequences. Sitting down before noon is practically a moral failing. Dust on the windowsill, a personal insult from the universe. Crumbs on the floor, a direct challenge to her worth as a human being. The vacuum cleaner is a beast, roughly the size and weight of a Buick, with a cord that's always 12 inches too short. Vacuum tracks in the carpet are her medals of honor, crop circles of domestic achievement, signaling to all who enter, I am not slacking. Laundry day is an odyssey. The washing machine shakes like it might walk itself into the next county. Whites are separated from colors with military precision. Anything less than dazzling gets run through the ringer, literally, and hung on the line with a prayer to the gods of sunshine and breeze, and heaven help her if a bird flies overhead at the wrong moment. By afternoon, she pivots to chef, launching into the next act, dinner. Casseroles bubble in the oven. Jello molds glisten with menace. Candles are lit to make everything feel just the right amount of fancy. And when the family finally sits down, everyone believes, if only for a minute, that the world is perfectly ordered, thanks to the invisible labor of the woman who hasn't sat down since sunrise. Meanwhile, Dad's day is its own kind of performance. He rises like a reluctant ghost, navigating the minefield of scattered toys and discarded socks. His bathroom ritual is sacred. Shave with a razor sharp enough to cut time. Splash on aftershave strong enough to stun a moose. Style hair into submission with a wet comb. He dresses in the uniform of mid-century compromise gray flannel suit. Conservative tie, polished shoes. His briefcase holds the holy trinity of American manhood, a thermos of coffee, a bologna sandwich, an existential dread. He drives to work in a car longer than a modern condo, joining a herd of men in identical suits, marching into glass towers where their job is to blend in, get by, and never ask questions about fulfillment. 8 hours of fluorescent lights, endless memos, suppressed dreams, and then, at 5 on the dot, he reverses the process, returning home a little more wrinkled, a little more tired, hoping someone saved him a corner piece of meatloaf, Because in the 1950s, that's just what you did. You commuted, you provided, and you made silence look easy. Now, let's talk about the children. Clean, obedient, suspiciously shiny, expected to look like Norman Rockwell paintings and act like future senators. Emotions contained, opinions rationed, individuality only if it involves reciting multiplication tables with perfect diction. School is a performance to pledge of allegiance. Silent classrooms, teachers addressed as sir or ma'am. Recess is organized chaos. If you skin your knee, you're handed a Band-Aid and a speech about toughening up. Crying is forbidden unless you want to be nicknamed Waterworks until high school. After school, you come straight home. No loitering. No malt shops. Homework is done under watchful eyes because sloppy penmanship is clearly the first sign of moral decline. Evenings are choreographed. Half an hour of television, nothing controversial. Then bed, pajamas buttoned all the way up, falling asleep to the distant hum of adult conversation you'll never understand. And outside, the lawn. Oh, the lawn. This isn't grass. This is a battlefield. Every Saturday, you're drafted into mowing, raking, battling dandelions like they personally insulted your ancestors. Your father inspects the results like a general reviewing troops. Mow in straight lines. Crooked rows. First sign of family decline. Rake every leaf, even the invisible ones. Dandelions. Eradicate them with righteous fury, because lawns aren't about beauty, they're about what they represent. Order, decency, and the desperate need to keep up appearances. A patchy spot isn't just a patchy spot. It's a whispered scandal, a reason for Mrs. Kravitz to write a note for the next HOA meeting. So you mow, rake, edge, repeat, knowing that next Saturday you'll do it all again. Because in suburbia, a man's home is his castle, but his lawn is his legacy. Then comes dinner. Dinner. Sometimes it's a casserole, mystery meat, suspended in cream of mushroom soup. Sometimes it's Salisbury steak from an aluminum tray, a marvel of mid-century science, delivered straight from the freezer aisle. 3 compartments. One for meat, one for vegetables, one for dessert, separated by walls of stamped aluminum. Stronger than family secrets, you peel back the foil like an archaeologist uncovering a tomb, greeted by the smell of instant gravy and the comforting temps of preservatives, eaten on your lap. Utensils real, food suspiciously uniform. Mashed potatoes that could anchor a boat, peas boiled into submission, and the Salisbury steak, a patty of uncertain origin, smothered in vaguely brown gravy. The TV blares sitcoms, laughter from the screen, none from the family. Speaking is discouraged. Conversation, if it happens, is limited to debates about whether to eat the brownie square with a fork. In theory, it's supposed to bring everyone together. In reality, it's the perfect excuse to avoid eye contact for 20 gravy-soaked minutes. And when the tray is empty, it's cleared, quietly stacked, washed, or sometimes just tossed away. Because nothing says progress like disposable dinnerware. For mom, it's a small mercy, a pause in the kitchen gauntlet. For dad, it's another silent meal. For the dog, official member of the Clean Plate Club. But waste is a sin. Hunger is just one missed paycheck away. So you finish every bite, even the lima beans, while being reminded of the starving children in Europe. The dog, of course, is exempt later. When the dishes are done and the kids are in bed, the adults descend to the basement, the only place where real emotions are allowed to breathe. Amid wood paneling and tasseled lamps, gin flows, martini glasses clink, cigarette smoke curls toward the ceiling like prayers. The record player spins Perry Como, and for a few stolen hours, the masks come off, secrets slip out with the olive brine. Someone confesses their famous pie is a Betty Crocker mix. Another admits their husband has been sleeping in the den since Easter. Laughter bubbles up, equal parts confession and commiseration. A support group in pearls and heels, fueled by gin and good intentions. And if nobody's watching, there's dancing, slippers shuffling, hips swaying, a moment of pure joy, spun away on a living room dance floor. Because in the 1950s, mothers and martinis weren't just a stereotype. They were a survival strategy, a pressure valve, a quiet rebellion upstairs. Everything returns to its proper place. Downstairs, the secrets settle in, waiting for the next hand to be dealt. And somewhere beneath it all, behind the model trains, the Tupperware parties, the PTA bake sales, lies the truth. This wasn't simplicity. This was survival. A generation performing perfection while quietly medicating anxiety with casseroles, cocktails, and the illusion of plenty. They smiled through duck-and-covered drills. They laughed during cocktail hour. They mowed lawns like their reputations depended on it, because they did. So tonight, as you lie in your soft bed, surrounded by comforts they couldn't imagine, give a quiet nod to those who came before, to the women who burped Tupperware lids like they were sealing the fate of nations, to the men who found freedom in whittling ducks and building miniature railroads. To the children who learned to survive on silence, suspicion, and the faint hope that tomorrow's casserole might actually taste good. They weren't happy, not always, but they endured, and in their quiet, stubborn way, they made it through. So close your eyes, let the hum of modern appliances lull you to sleep, and may your dreams be free of Jell-O salad. Evening falls, not with a crash, but with a sigh, the kind that escapes when you finally sit down after 10 hours of standing, perfectly still inside your own skin. Outside, fireflies flicker like tiny Morse code signals from a world that still believes in magic. Inside, the refrigerator hums its low, mechanical lullaby, and the last light of the day bleeds through laced curtains, casting delicate shadows across walls that have witnessed more silence than confession. This is the hour when the mask loosens just a fraction. Dad loosens his tie the moment the front door closes, as if shedding a layer of skin that never quite fit. He doesn't speak, not yet. He pours himself a glass of something amber, leans against the kitchen counter, and stares out the window at the neighbor's perfectly aligned azaleas. No words are needed. The exhaustion is in the slump of his shoulders, the way his fingers tremble slightly as he raises the glass. Mom retreats to the bathroom, not to freshen her lipstick this time, but to breathe. Just breathe. She locks the door, leans her forehead against the cool tile, and for 30 seconds, she isn't Mrs. Henderson. She isn't honey or mom or hostess of the month. She's just a woman who hasn't had a full thought to herself since 1948, when she emerges. Her smile is back in place, but her eyes are tired in a way that no amount of Pond's cold cream can fix. Upstairs, The children whisper in the dark, voices muffled by blankets, and the unspoken rule that nighttime is for sleeping, not for asking questions like why does Uncle Frank never visit anymore? Or what happens if the bomb really does fall? But the questions linger anyway, echoing in the space between heartbeats, because, for all its chrome and casseroles, the 1950s wasn't simple. It was suffocatingly precise. Every emotion had a proper container. Grief went in the back of the closet, tucked behind winter coats. Anger was redirected into vigorous vacuuming. Loneliness, that was just a touch of nerves, easily soothed by a pink pill and a game of bridge, and yet beneath it, all people found ways to feel, not loudly, not disruptively, but in gestures, the extra pat of butter on a husband's toast, the way a mother hums an old jazz tune while folding laundry, the secret stash of romance novels hidden behind the encyclopedia set. These were the quiet rebellions, the tiny acts of resistance against a world that demanded you be cheerful, compliant, and utterly predictable sometimes. Rebellion looked like a woman sitting on the front porch after dark, just her, a cigarette, and the stars refusing to come inside until she'd watched the moon rise. Sometimes it was a teenager tuning the radio to a forbidden station, letting little Richard's voice crack through the static like a promise that things could be wild, messy, and alive. Even the men had their escapes, not just the garage or the basement, but the open road, a Sunday drive with no destination, windows down, hand resting on the roof of the car like a king surveying his realm. In those moments, they weren't breadwinners or committee chairmen or dutiful sons. They were just men, breathing air that hadn't been filtered through linoleum and obligation. And then there were the women who didn't conform, who wore slacks to the grocery store, who spoke openly about birth control, who refused to smile when they weren't happy. They were called difficult, unfeminine, a bad influence. But in hushed tones, other women admired them, wished they had the courage. And sometimes, in the privacy of their own kitchens, they mimicked their posture, shoulders back, chin up as if practicing for a life they couldn't yet claim. The truth is, the 1950s wasn't a golden age. It was a gilded cage, polished to brilliance on the outside, but rigid, airless, and lined with velvet expectations that chafed more than they comforted. People didn't live in this airway, they performed it. Every meal, every outfit, every wave to the neighbors was a scene in a play with no intermission and no understudy. But here's what the history books often miss. Within that performance, real love still bloomed. Not the cinematic kind with grand declarations, but the quiet, stubborn kind, the kind that shows up in packed lunches, mended socks, and the way someone always saves you the last slice of pie, even when they're hungry too. So yes, the Jell-O molds were absurd. The fallout drills were terrifying. The silence around mental health was deafening. But people endured not because they were naive, but because they were hopeful. They believed, however desperately, that if they kept the lawn green and the children clean and the dinner table peaceful, maybe, just maybe, the world wouldn't fall apart at the seams. And in the end, that's the real legacy of the 1950s. Not perfection, but perseverance. Not happiness, but the relentless, flawed, deeply human effort to pretend well enough until something better came along. Now, sleep. Let the whir of the ceiling fan carry you off. Let the scent of lemon-scented wax and faint cigarette smoke wrap around you like a quilt stitched from contradictions. Dream of chrome fenders and soda fountains, of saddle shoes and transistor radios, of a time when the future felt both terrifying and full of promise. And when you wake, remember this: you are not living in their world anymore, but you carry their resilience, their quiet courage, their stubborn love in your bones, and that, more than any perfectly vacuumed carpet or three-layered casserole, is what truly lasted. The quiet rebellion of routine. There's a myth that the 1950s were simple. But simplicity doesn't require this much effort. Every sock folded just so. Every spoon aligned in the drawer. Every smile rehearsed in the mirror before the doorbell rings. This isn't Iset's orchestration. A daily ballet performed in pastel kitchens and vacuum-tracked living rooms, where even a misplaced coaster could signal moral decay. And yet, within that rigor, people carved out slivers of selfhood, not in grand declarations, but in the spaces between obligations, in the way a woman lingers at the mailbox just a moment too long, staring down the street as if waiting for a letter that will never come, just in case. In the way a man whistles a forbidden jazz tune under his breath, tightening the bolts on a model train that will never leave the basement. In the way children trade whispered rumors about rock in, roll like contraband, pressing their ears to transistor radios as if the music might save them. Because salvation in the 50s didn't come from sermons or salesmen, it came from stolen moments. A cigarette on the back step after bedtime, a dog-eared novel hidden beneath the mattress, a record slipped into the sleeve of a Perry Como album in case someone looks. These were the tiny acts of defiance that kept souls from turning to dust. And then there were the holidays, the ultimate performance. Thanksgiving wasn't just a meal. It was a test of endurance, culinary precision, and emotional containment. The turkey had to be golden, the cranberry sauce had to jiggle just so, and the conversation had to avoid politics, Aunt Mildred's drinking, and the fact that Uncle Frank hadn't filed taxes since Eisenhower took office. Christmas was worse. Not because of the presents, though those were choreographed too, wrapped in paper that matched the tree skirt, but because of the expectation of joy. Real joy. Uncomplicated joy. As if trauma and tension dissolved under twinkling lights and a Nat King Cole record. Families gathered in wool sweaters and forced cheer, exchanging gifts that said, "I see you," while their eyes said, "Please don't ask how I'm really doing." Children tore into packages with practiced enthusiasm, already plotting how to trade the sweater for the cap gun. And somewhere in the kitchen, Mom refilled her wine glass with something stronger than sherry, just to make it through desert. Even birthdays were minefields. Too much excitement, unseemly, not enough gratitude. A moral failing. The cake had to be homemade, but not to homemade store-bought. Frosting was acceptable if you were busy, and the candles, only as many as the child could reasonably blow out without hyperventilating or crying. But here's what no one talks about. Sometimes, in the quiet after the guests left and the dishes were done, someone would sit alone in the dark living room, still in their party dress or clip-on tie, just breathing. No performance, no audience, just a human being, finally allowed to exist without a script. And in those minutes, fleeting, Fragile, forgotten by morning, the mask would slip not into despair, but into something rarer. Authenticity, the unseen architecture of belonging. Suburbia didn't just sell houses, it sold identity. Your driveway width signaled your ambition, your front door wreath declared your seasonal patriotism, your children's report cards proof you hadn't failed as a citizen. To live in the neighborhood was to sign an invisible covenant, not just about paint colors and hedge heights, but about silence, about conformity, about never letting the neighbors see you struggle, because struggle implied weakness, and weakness invited judgment, so you smiled. When your husband lost his bonus, you laughed. When your casserole collapsed at the church potluck, you waved cheerfully from the porch, even when your hands were shaking from the latest round of nerves. And if someone did crack, Mrs. Peterson across the street started crying during bridge club, or Mr. Callahan stopped mowing his lawn, everyone knew what to do. Not speak of it, not ask, just adjust. Casseroles appeared on doorsteps. Children were kept indoors during certain hours, and the PTA quietly reorganized the carpool to give the family some space. It wasn't cruelty, it was a different kind of care, one that prized dignity over disclosure, privacy over pity. But beneath that restraint, empathy still flowed, quietly, carefully, like water through cracks in concrete. You didn't hug your neighbor when her son flunked out of college, but you made sure her trash cans were always at the curb on pickup day. You didn't confront the man who drank too much at backyard barbecues, but you always handed him the weakest beer and steered the conversation toward fishing. This was the language of the era, spoken in gestures, not words, in actions, not confessions. The children who watched hand through it all. The kids watched not with innocence, but with the sharp, silent observation of hostages negotiating their own captivity. They learned early, don't cry in public, don't question authority, don't let your weirdness show. But they also learned to read the gaps. Way Dad's knuckles whitened when the news mentioned communists. The way Mom's smile didn't reach her eyes after the doctor's appointment. The way the adults fell quiet whenever the phone rang after 9. They absorbed the unspoken curriculum. Keep it together. Keep it clean. Keep it quiet. And yet somehow they dreamed anyway of drive-ins and diner jukeboxes, of greased-back hair and pedal pushers, of a world where feelings weren't flaws and difference wasn't danger. They didn't know it yet, but they were the seeds of the storm to come, the generation that would trade duck-and-cover drills for protest marches, gelatin salads for liberation, silence for song. But for now, they played Red Rover in the coal-D-sack. They did their homework in neat cursive, and at night they stared at the ceiling and wondered if anyone else felt this. Itchy inside, epilogue, the legacy of the performance. We look back on the 1950s with nostalgia or disdain, rarely with nuance. But the truth is more complicated. Yes, it was a time of stifling conformity. Yes, it masked pain with pastel. Yes, it excluded, repressed, and policed joy. But it was also a time of fierce, quiet love. Of parents who worked 3 jobs so their kids wouldn't know hunger. Of neighbors who showed up with soup when illness struck, no questions asked. Of families who sat in silence, not because they had nothing to say, but because they were protecting each other from the weight of the world. They weren't perfect, but they were trying, and in their trying, in their casseroles and cocktails, their lawn wars and whispered confessions, they built something fragile, flawed, and undeniably human. So the next time you see a photo of a 1950s family smiling stiff, suspiciously tidy, don't just see the performance, see the people behind it, tired, tender, terrified, and still showing up, because that's not just history, that's heritage, and somewhere, in the hum of a vintage refrigerator or the squeak of a basement stair, their ghosts are still whispering, "Keep going, it gets better." The machinery of normalcy in the 1950s. Normal wasn't a setting, it was a mandate. Every mailbox stood at attention. Every driveway gleamed with freshly waxed Fords. Every front porch displayed the correct number of potted geraniums, not too many ostentatious, not too few slovenly. To live in this world was to participate in a collective performance so seamless, so rehearsed, that deviation wasn't just noticed, it was mourned, like a death in the social order. And yet, within that rigid choreography, cracks began to form. Not loudly, not with protest signs or public outbursts, those would come later, but in the quiet moments, a woman turning off the radio instead of listening to another commercial for powdered eggs, a teenager leaving a Little Richard record out on the record player, just long enough for his father to see it, a man staring out the window during cocktail hour, wondering if there's more to life than quarterly reports and perfectly trimmed hedges. These weren't rebellions, not yet, just tremors. But tremors precede earthquakes. The system held together, not through force, but through shamda, velvet-trapped kind that arrived in the form of a neighbor's raised eyebrow or a clipped sentence at the PTA meeting. We were all just so surprised that someone would let their grass grow half an inch too tall, surprised that a woman would be seen at the grocery store without lipstick, surprised that a child might ask why the school books never showed families who looked different, but surprise, in suburbia, was code for judgment, and judgment was the glue that kept the whole facade intact. People found loopholes. The garage, as we've seen, was one a sanctuary of unfinished dreams and half-rusted tools where a man could pretend for an hour that he was building something real. The basement rec room was another, a smoky cave, where laughter could be a little too loud and confessions a little too honest. But the most potent act of quiet defiance, it happened in the dark, not in bedrooms at least, not the kind anyone would dare discuss, but at the drive-in theater, where teenagers pressed close in the back seats of borrowed cars, sharing secrets and stolen kisses, while the screen flickered with black and white morality tales they no longer believed in. Here, beneath the stars and the hum of the speaker box, the future was being written not in policy or protest, but in whispered conversations about music that made your chest ache, about books that made you question everything, about a world where maybe, just maybe, you didn't have to wear a mask to be loved. The myth of the nuclear family. The nuclear family, mom, dad, 2.3 children, a dog named Spot, and a casserole that never failed to impress the minister. It was less a reality and more a national brand, a logo stamped onto everything from laundry detergent to fallout shelter brochures. Advertisers sold it. Politicians praised it. Schools reinforced it. And if your life didn't match the image, you didn't talk about it. You just worked harder to pretend. But behind closed doors, the truth was messier. Marriages strained under the weight of unspoken expectations. Fathers drank alone in the garage, not out of malice, but because silence was the only language they'd been taught. Mothers swallowed their exhaustion with a smile and a martini, because admitting fatigue felt like admitting failure. Children learned early. Love was conditional. You were loved when you made honor roll, loved when you didn't track mud inside, loved when you laughed at your uncle's jokes, even if they made your stomach twist. But what if you didn't fit? What if you were the boy who preferred sketching to baseball, the girl who asked too many questions in Sunday school, the child who looked at the rows of identical houses and wondered why no one seemed to feel anything real? You learned to hide, to fold yourself into the shape the world demanded, to tuck your strangeness into the back of the closet, behind the winter coats and the Christmas decorations you weren't supposed to touch. And still you dreamed, because repression breeds imagination. And imagination is the first step toward revolution. The Seeds of Tomorrow by the late 1950s. The seams were starting to show. Elvis swiveled his hips on national television, and mothers gasped, but their daughters didn't look away. Jack Kerouac published On the Road. And suddenly the open highway wasn't just for family vacations. It was a metaphor for escape. Rosa Parks refused to move. And though the evening news downplayed it, something shifted in the air, something electric, dangerous, and necessary. In living rooms across America, people began to wonder, what if we've been sold a lie? Not the big, dramatic lie of villains and conspiracies, but the quiet, suffocating lie that happiness looks the same for everyone, that stability is worth the cost of your voice, that safety is worth the cost of your soul. And so, in the final years of the decade, a new question began to circulate, not in speeches or headlines, but in hushed conversations between friends, in dog-eared paperbacks passed under desks, in the defiant beat of a drum that refused to march in time. What if I want more? It was a dangerous question, but it was also a human one, and it would grow slowly at first, like a weed in a perfectly manicured lawn until it could no longer be ignored. Epilogue. The weight of the past we romanticize the 1950s because the surfaces were clean, but real life doesn't happen on the surface. It happens in the basement, in the garage, in the back seat of a car parked under a flickering street lamp. It happens in the space between fine, thanks, and the truth you're too tired to speak. People of that era weren't simple. They were survivors, a world that demanded perfection while offering little grace for imperfection. And yet, they loved, they built, they endured, not because everything was perfect, however desperately, that tomorrow could be better. So the next time you see a photo of a 1950s family, stiff, suspiciously tidy, don't just see the performance. The person behind it who stayed up all night mending a torn dress so their child could look presentable. See the father who took a second job so the mortgage wouldn't slip. See the mother who buried her art supplies in the attic but never threw them away just in case. Living a golden age, they were laying the groundwork for ours, and that, more than any Jell-O mold or vacuum track, is what deserves to be remembered. The architecture of exclusion beneath the white picket fences and pastel shutters of 1950s suburbia lay a blueprint, not just of domestic bliss. Design. Every cul-de-sac, every manicured hedge, every identical ranch house was constructed on a foundation of sameness, not by accident, not by preference alone, but by policy, by covenant, by the quiet collusion of realtors, lenders, and neighbors who called it community standards while meaning something far colder. You never saw the paperwork. It was folded neatly into closing documents, buried in legalese, signed with a hopeful pen before the moving truck even arrived. But the message was clear. This neighborhood is for certain kinds of people. The kind who looked like your parents, who worshipped like your church, whose last names appeared in the right social register, or at least pretended to. If you asked why no one on your block looked different, why the mailman, the grocer, the school janitor, all lived elsewhere, you were told it was just how things were. Stable, they called it. Safe. Never mind that safety, for some, meant exclusion for others. There were no signs, no gates, just 1,000 tiny signals. The way the welcome committee never showed up for that family. The way the PTA meetings grew quieter when certain topics arose. The way children on the playground suddenly had allergies to sleepovers they'd once begged for. It wasn't shouted, it was whispered, and the silence was louder than any siren. This was polite racism, the kind that wore gloves to garden club and served lemonade with a smile while ensuring the swimming pool membership list remained exclusive, the kind that claimed to love fairness while quietly redlining entire communities out of the American dream. Even the children absorbed it, not through lessons, but through absence. The missing faces in school photos, the uninvited names at birthday parties, the way adults' voices lowered when the news mentioned integration or urban unrest. And if you dared to ask why can't Jimmy come over, you were met with a tight smile and a swift pivot. We don't talk about that. It's complicated. You'll understand when you're older, but you never did. Not really, because the truth was never meant to be understoodly inherited. The weight of the unseen, for those who did fit the mold. The pressure was just as immense, though of a different kind, to be a good family in the 1950s wasn't just about behavior. It was about performance. Every interaction with neighbors, every church pew, every grocery run was a silent audition for belonging. You didn't just mow your lawn, you mowed it in checkerboard patterns. Because your father believed God and the Joneses were watching. You didn't just bake a casserole, you baked one that would make the ladies at Bridge Club lean in with envy. You didn't just raise children, you raised representatives of your moral worth. And woe to the household that faltered. A divorce, scandal, a son who preferred poetry to baseball, concerning a daughter caught wearing makeup before high school, practically delinquent. The stakes were high because the contract was absolute: conform or be cast out, not with banishment, but with silence. The kind of silence that cuts deeper than shouting. So families smiled wider, laughed louder, polished their silver more often. Anything to prove they were still in, still worthy, still part of the dream. But inside, the tension hummed like a faulty refrigerator, the first cracks in the facade. Yet heaven, in this world of rigid order, rebellion began not with marches, but with music. It started with a guitar riff on a transistor radio, a sway of hips on a black and white screen, a lyric that said, "I'm not like them," and made 1,000 teenagers sit up straighter in their starched collars. Elvis wasn't just a singer. He was a signal. Rock and roll wasn't just noise. It was a language of dissent. Adults called it jungle music, said it would rot your brain. But the kids knew better. They knew it was the first sound they'd ever heard that understood their restlessness. Meanwhile, other tremors spread. Jack Kerouac published On the Road. And suddenly, the open highway wasn't just for family vacations. It was a metaphor for escape. Rosa Parks sat down, and the nation could no longer pretend the system was fair. James Baldwin wrote with a clarity so fierce it forced even the comfortable to look away, or finally see, in living rooms across America. People began to wonder, what if the life I've been given isn't the only one possible? Not all of them acted, not yet, but the question itself was revolutionary, because once you ask us, this all there is, you can never fully unask it. The quiet before the storm by the end of the decade. The 1950s stood like a perfectly set jello mold, shimmering, structured, and trembling on the edge of collapse. The surface still held. The lawns were still green. The casseroles still bubbled. The children still said yes, ma'am, and no, sir, without irony. But beneath it all, a new current was rising. Girls who once accepted their aprons began clipping articles about careers. Boys who once dreamed of corporate security started sketching folk songs in their notebooks. Mothers who once swallowed their exhaustion with martinis began asking, "What if I want more than this?" And fathers, those stoic men in gray flannel, sometimes stood in their garages long after dark, staring at half-built model trains, wondering if the tiny towns they created were more real than the one they lived in. The decade would end not with a bang, but with a breath held too long, and in the next one, that breath would finally be released in protest, in poetry, in passion. But for now, the performance continued. Dinner was served. The vacuum tracks were perfect. The jello wobbled just right, and no one mentioned the world outside, because in the 1950s, survival didn't look like revolution. It looked like pretending in till you could afford to stop. The quiet before the awakening. By 1959, the script had begun to fray at the edges. Not loudly, not yet. The casseroles still bubbled. The lawns still gleamed. The children still said yes, ma'am, with just the right blend of obedience and vacant cheer. But something had shifted in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm, when the birds fall quiet and the air itself seems to hold its breath. It started in the margins, in the way a housewife paused a second too long before reapplying her lipstick in the mirror, eyes asking a question she wasn't allowed to speak, in the way a teenager turned the radio dial a hair further, chasing a signal that played songs with raw throats and untamed rhythms, in the way fathers lingered in their driveways after work, not quite ready to step back into the performance. The 1950s had sold itself as a world of answers, but the younger generation was starting to notice. No one had ever let them ask the questions. And once you realize you've been living in a story written by someone else, you start to wonder what your own voice might sound like. The cracks in the wallpaper, the illusion of harmony, had always been carefully maintained with bleach, bobby pins, and a firm belief that if you didn't talk about the rot, it wouldn't spread. But rot doesn't care about silence in living rooms across America. The evening news grew more unsettling, not just with talk of missiles and red scares, but with images of black students walking into schools flanked by federal marshals, of ministers speaking in cadences that shook the soul, not just the congregation, of women in cities marching not for pie recipes, but for paychecks and personhood. These weren't those people. They were people real, urgent, undeniable, and for the first time, the TV screen didn't just reflect the world as it should be. It showed the world as it was messy, unjust, and demanding to be seen. Mothers who once clipped recipes now clipped newspaper columns about civil rights. Fathers who once only read the sports page found themselves lingering over editorials about freedom, and children, they saw it, all wide-eyed, unfiltered, unprotected by the polite fiction that everything's fine. The duck-and-cover drills began to feel less like preparation and more like surrender. The first whisper of choice then came the books, not the ones assigned in school, those still featured families who looked like department store mannequins, but the ones passed hand to hand in library stacks or hidden under mattresses. The feminine mystique on the road, go tell it on the mountain. These weren't just stories, they were lifelines for a woman who'd spent her life folding laundry and smiling through bridge club, reading Betty Friedan's opening line. The problem that has no name was like hearing her own thoughts spoken aloud for the first time. For a young man tired of becoming a company man, Kerouac's vision of open highways and unscripted nights offered a different kind of American dream, one built not on conformity, but on authenticity. And for a black teenager in a segregated town, Baldwin's prose was both a mirror and a map. You are not broken. The world is dot. These books didn't shout, they whispered. You are not alone. And in that whisper lay the seed of revolution. The garage becomes a studio, even the sanctuaries changed. Dad's basement workshop, once a retreat for model trains and whittled ducks, now sometimes held a different kind of creation. Maybe a son had brought down a guitar. Maybe a daughter had set up a typewriter on the old card table. The hum of the record player shifted from Perry Como to Chuck Berry, from orchestral strings to raw electric riffs that made the walls vibrate. About that noise, but inside those basements and garages, something sacred was happening. Self-expression, no audience, no judgment, just the thrill of making something that felt true, even if it was off-key, misspelled, or unfinished. Art in the 1950s wasn't for galleries, it was for survival. The last summer of innocence, 1959, felt like a held breath. Families still packed into station wagons for cross-country trips. Kids still chased fireflies in coal-d-sacks. Mothers still served Jell-O salad at potlucks, though fewer people pretended to like it. But beneath the rituals, a new energy pulsed. Younger siblings questioned why they couldn't wear pants to church. Teenagers argued that Elvis wasn't corrupting anyone, he was liberating them. And in hushed conversations after PTA meetings, women began to ask, what if I want more than this? Not all of them acted, not yet, but the question itself was electric, because the 1950s hadn't just built a world, it had built a cage, and now the locks were beginning to rattle. Epilogue, the threshold, Daz. No one flipped a switch and shouted, "The 60s begin now." History doesn't work that way. Instead, it crept in through vinyl records, through courtroom rulings, through the quiet courage of a single no, spoken where yes had always been expected, but with a door left ajar, just wide enough for a guitar to slip through, for a march to begin, for a generation to finally say, "This isn't the only way to live." And so, as the last jello mold of the decade set in the fridge, uncertain, faintly glowing under the kitchen light, America stood on the edge of something it couldn't yet name, but it could feel it in the radio. Static, in the silence after dinner, in the way a young girl looked at her mother's tired eyes and whispered, "I won't do this." The golden age was over, not because it was exposed as false, but because people finally dared to imagine something better. And that was the most American thing of all. The threshold of change by the very end of the decade. Something had shifted, not in headlines or laws yet, but in the air, in the silence between sitcom laugh tracks, in the pause before the prayer at dinner, in the way a teenager's fingers lingered on the radio dial, searching not for reassurance, but resonance. The 1950s had built a fortress of normalcy brick by pastel brick. Lawnmower pass by, lawnmower pass, but no wall is truly soundproof. And from beyond its manicured borders, new voices began to bleed through, raw, urgent, alive. Elvis had already shaken hips. James Dean had already died young. Rosa Parks had already refused to move, and somewhere in a cramped apartment in Harlem, James Baldwin was writing sentences so honest they felt like acts of war inside the suburbs. The tremors were subtle. A mother left her vacuum running while she read a pamphlet about birth control, not for herself, she'd insist, but for a friend. A father let his son keep the rock and roll record, muttering, "Just don't play it when company's over." A daughter asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Why can't girls be scientists?" and wasn't immediately corrected. These weren't revolutions, they were seeds, and seeds don't roar, they wait. The word children who listened, the real inheritors of the decade, weren't the parents polishing their porch railings or the politicians drawing red lines on maps. They were the children, those wide-eyed spectators of the great performance who had spent their lives learning the script only to realize they didn't want to play the part. They'd memorized the choreography of casseroles and church suppers, of duck and cover drills and dinner table diplomacy. But they'd also noticed the gaps, the way Mom's smile didn't reach her eyes after bridge club, the way Dad stared at the ceiling long after the TV went dark, and they began to wonder, what if we wrote our own lines? This generation wouldn't burn the suburbs down, not yet, but they would stop pretending the house was perfect when the foundation was rotting. They'd trade jello molds for folk songs, swap vacuum tracks for protest marches. Replace yes, M-A-M with hell, no. Not out of cruelty, but clarity. Not to destroy the past, but to finally speak their truth. The women who stayed quiet until they didn't for years. The housewife had been the unsung architect of the American dreams. stitching it together with bobby pins, casseroles, and the quiet art of emotional containment. She'd smiled through migraines, swallowed panic with martinis, and buried her name beneath Mrs. Tzlak. It was a necessary sacrifice. But by 1959, something flickered in her gaze when she looked in the mirror. Not resentment, but recognition. I am more than this. She still made the pie for the bake sale, still pressed her husband's shirts, still kissed her children goodnight with the same tenderness. But now, she also kept a copy of the feminine mystique tucked beneath her sewing basket. She signed up for a night class at the community college, just for fun, she told the neighbors. And sometimes, when the house was finally quiet, she sat alone in the kitchen, not cleaning, not planning, just being. That stillness was radical, because to simply exist as a woman, as a person, without performing usefulness, was to defy the entire script. She wouldn't just read about change, she'd demand it. The end of the performance, the 1950s, didn't collapse with a bang. It unraveled thread by thread, a dropped casserole dish that no one rushed to clean up, a teenager who left the house in jeans and didn't care who saw, a husband who admitted, over late-night bourbon, that he hated his job. The illusion of perfection didn't shatter it, softened, and in that softness, humanity finally had room to breathe. By January 1st, 1960, the stage was set not for a continuation, but for a reckoning. The props were still there, the chrome toasters, the pastel kitchens, the white picket fences, but the actors were changing their lines, and this time, they weren't asking for permission. Epilogue, the gift of the facade we mock. The 1950s, now its Jell-O salads, its emotional repression, its desperate grip on order. But to dismiss it as naive is to miss its deepest truth. It was an act of love, flawed, stifling, exclusionary, but also born of a generation that had survived war, depression, and global collapse. They built a world of lawns and casseroles, not because they were blind, but because they were terrified and determined to protect what little piece they'd scraped together. They didn't know how to talk about trauma, so they vacuumed it away. They didn't know how to process fear, so they baked it into pies. Their mistake wasn't wanting safety, it was believing safety required silence. But from that silence, their children learned to speak. From that rigidity, they learned to bend. From that conformity, they learned to dream differently. So as the final credits of the 1950s roll not with fanfare, but with the soft click of a Tupperware lid sealing one last leftover casserole, we don't laugh. We thank them for the stability, however fragile, for the love, however unspoken, for the world they tried to build, if it wasn't big enough to hold everyone. And then, with tenderness and resolve, we step into the next decade, not to erase their legacy, but to expand it. Because the American story was never meant to end in a perfectly mowed lawn. It was meant to keep growing wild, messy, and gloriously alive. The first fracture, 1960, and the end of the facade, January 1960, doesn't feel different the morning it arrives. The percolator still hisses. The linoleum still gleams. Mom still applies lipstick before the sun rises. But something has shifted beneath the surface, like a fault line, finally giving way after years of quiet pressure. Because the truth is this: the 1950s didn't end. They exploded. And the explosion began not in the streets, but in the silences. In living rooms where teenagers left the TV on mute and turned up Little Richard instead. In college dorms, where girls whispered about the feminine mystique like it was contraband. In churches where pastors quietly questioned segregation while parishioners clutched their hymnals tighter. The first sign that the world was changing wasn't to protest, it was a question. Why? Why must I marry to be whole? Why must I salute a flag that doesn't protect everyone? Why must I pretend to be happy when I'm drowning in quiet? These questions didn't roar. They echoed, and echoes have a way of gathering force. The children grow up and refuse to perform. The kids who once sat stiffly at dinner tables, eyes down, forks poised like diplomats, are now in high school and they're done playing the part. They don't want to inherit their father's gray flannel resignation. They don't want to replicate their mother's cheerful martyrdom. They want something raw, real, and theirs. So they grow their hair long. They wear black turtlenecks like armor. They read poetry aloud in cafes that smell of espresso and rebellion. And when they're told to act like a lady or be a man, they laugh a sharp, knowing sound that terrifies their parents more than any Cold War headline. Because this generation isn't afraid of bombs. They're afraid of wasting their lives on a script they never agreed to. They trade duck-and-cover drills for sightings, swap TV dinners for shared bowls of bean soup in drafty apartments, replace yes ma'am with hell no, not out of disrespect, but out of love for a world that could be better. And their parents. They watch from porches, hearts breaking and bewildered, wondering where they went wrong, never realizing they did everything right for a world that no longer exists. The women step out of the kitchen and into the streets. Housewife, who once measured her worth in vacuum tracks and perfectly fluted pie crusts, is now sitting at the kitchen table late at night, not planning tomorrow's menu, but drafting a letter to the school board about unequal pay, to the newspaper about housing discrimination, to herself, reminding her that she is more than a hostess, more than a helpmate, more than Mrs. She still makes the casserole for the church potluck, but now she signs her own name to the sign-up sheet. She still wears gloves to the grocery store, but now she also wears a button that says, "Votes for Women," a phrase that sounds old-fashioned but feels revolutionary. And when her daughters ask, "Can I be a doctor?" instead of "Who will I marry?" she doesn't laugh it off. She says, "Yes, and you'll be brilliant." This isn't just feminism, it's resurrection, because, for the first time, women aren't just surviving the domestic stage, they're walking off it. The music changes and so does everything else. In 1959, rock and roll was a scandal. By 1965, it's the soundtrack of a revolution. Elvis's hips were just the warning shot. Now Bob Dylan's voice cuts through the static like a knife. The times, they are a-changing. Folk music isn't just melody, it's message. Jazz isn't just rhythm, it's resistance. And soul is truth, sung so loud it shakes the walls of segregated diners and complacent suburbs alike. You can't control a generation that dances like no one's watching because they've stopped caring who is watching. And the music spreads fast, from jukeboxes in black neighborhoods to college radio stations to the earbuds of a white teenager in Ohio who's never met a black person but feels in his bones that something is deeply wrong. Art doesn't ask for permission, it demands witness, and America is finally listening. The dream expands, or it breaks. The 1950s sold a dream with a very narrow guest list. The 1960s begin tearing down the velvet rope. In Greensboro, for Black college. Students sit at a Woolworth's lunch counter and refuse to leave. In Birmingham, fire hoses blast children marching for justice, and the world watches in horror. In Washington, a preacher speaks of a dream so powerful it echoes through history. This isn't just civil rights, it's a reckoning, because you cannot build a nation on liberty while denying it to millions. You cannot call yourself free while your neighbor is chained by law, by fear, by silence. And the children of the 1950s, raised on TV, dinners, and tidy lawns, begin to see the rot beneath the paint. They don't just want change, they need it. Not for politics, for their souls. The fallout shelter becomes a metaphor. Remember the basement, the canned peaches, the folding cot, the vague hope that the Soviets might take weekends off. By 1963, no one's talking about fallout shelters anymore, because the real threat isn't outside. It's within. The enemy isn't communism, it's complacency, it's conformity, it's the lie that order is worth more than justice. The new survival kit doesn't contain spam and a transistor radio. It holds a protest sign, a voter registration card, and the courage to say, "Not in my name." Epilogue. The birth of a new America. The 1960s don't arrive neatly wrapped. They stumble in messy, loud, and unapologetic, like a teenager crashing. A dinner party with muddy boots and a guitar. They are not perfect. They are not peaceful. They are not polite, but they are alive. And after a decade of smiling through Jell-O salads and pretending everything was fine, aliveness is the most radical thing of all. So, as the last Tupperware lid of the 1950s clicks shut, the final casserole is served in silence. New voice rises, not from the TV, not from the pulpit, but from the people, saying, "We're done performing. We're ready to live." The unraveling, 1960, and the birth of the new self, the first year of the new decade, doesn't arrive with fanfare. There are no fireworks, no marching bands, no grand announcement that the script has changed. But something has shifted in the silence between commercials, in the space between "pass the potatoes" and "don't make waves," in the way a teenager lingers at the record store, thumbing through albums that feel less like music and more like maps to a different life. The 1950s didn't die, it cracked open and outpoured everything it had tried to contain. The children speak. The kids, who once sat stiffly at dinner tables, eyes down, forks poised like diplomats, are no longer playing the part. They've read Kerouac, they've heard Dylan, they've seen Emmett Till's photo in Jet magazine and can't unsee it. They don't want to inherit their father's gray flannel resignation. They don't want to replicate their mother's cheerful martyrdom. They want truth, even if it's messy, even if it hurts, even if it means burning the whole stage down. So they grow their hair long. They wear jeans with holes, not because they're poor, but because perfection is the enemy of authenticity. They gather in coffee houses and basements, reading poetry that sounds like rebellion set to rhythm. And when they're told to respect your elders, they ask, "What if my elders are wrong?" This isn't rudeness, it's awakening. The women step into the light. The housewife, who once measured her worth in vacuum tracks and perfectly fluted pie crusts, is now sitting at the kitchen table late at night, not planning tomorrow's menu, but drafting a letter to the school board about unequal pay, to the newspaper about housing discrimination, to herself, reminding her that she is more than a hostess, more than a helpmate, more than Mrs. She still makes the casserole for the church potluck, but now she signs her own name to the sign-up sheet. She still wears gloves to the grocery store, but now she also wears a button that says equal pay now, not as a statement, but as a promise to herself. And when her daughter asks, "Can I be a doctor?" instead of "Who will I marry?" she doesn't laugh it off. She says, "Yes, and you'll be brilliant." This isn't just feminism, it's resurrection, because, for the first time, women aren't just surviving the domestic stage, they're walking off it, mic in hand. The music becomes the message. In 1959, rock and roll was a scandal. By 1963, it's the soundtrack of moral clarity. Elvis's hips were just the warning shot. Now Bob Dylan's voice cuts through the static like a knife. How many roads must a man walk down before you call him a man? Folk music isn't just melody, it's moral urgency. Jazz isn't just rhythm, it's resistance. Soul is truth, sung so loud it shakes the walls of segregated diners and complacent suburbs alike. A white teenager in Ohio, who's never met a black person, hears Nina Simone sing "Mississippi Goddam" and suddenly understands. Rage as something sacred. Music doesn't ask for permission, it demands witness. And America is finally listening. The dream expands, or it breaks. The 1950s sold a dream with a very narrow guest list. The 1960s begin tearing down the velvet rope in Greensboro. 4 black college students sit at a Woolworth's lunch counter and refuse to leave in Birmingham. Fire hoses blast children marching for justice, and the world watches in horror in Washington. A preacher speaks of a dream so powerful it echoes through history. This isn't just civil rights, it's a reckoning, because you cannot build a nation on liberty while denying it to millions. You cannot call yourself free while your neighbor is chained by fear, by silence. And the children of the 1950s, raised on TV dinners and tidy lawns, begin to see the rot beneath the paint. Don't just want change, they need it, not for politics, for their souls. The war comes home. Meanwhile, another front opens, not overseas, but on the nightly news. Vietnam flickers across black and white screens during dinner, just after the weather and before the Ed Sullivan Show. At first, it's just boys doing their duty. Then it's body bags. Then it's classmates. College campuses, once quiet enclaves of tweed and tradition, become battlegrounds of conscience. Students burn draft cards like they're burning the old covenant. They chant, "Hell no, we won't go." Not out of cowardice, but out of a new moral courage. Parents weep not because their children are protesting, but because they finally understand this. War isn't being fought in the jungle, it's being fought in the soul of America. The personal is political, the 1950s said. Keep it private, the 1960s say. Nothing is privatized, especially not your pain. Women gather in consciousness-raising groups, sharing stories of unwanted pregnancies, forced marriages, and doctors who called them hysterical for wanting more than a kitchen. Gay men and women, long forced into shadows, begin to whisper, then speak, then organize, culminating in a riot at a dive bar in Greenwich Village that no one saw coming, but everyone needed. Stonewall isn't just a bar, it's a birthplace, because when you've been told your love is a crime, your existence a sin, sometimes the most radical act is to say, "I am here, and I won't hide." The end of innocence. By 1968, the decade has lost its optimism. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated on a balcony in Memphis. Robert Kennedy is gunned down in a hotel pantry. Students are shot dead at Kent State. The dream fractures, but even in the rubble, something new grows. Not a single movement, but many. Black power, women's liberation, gay rights, environmentalism, anti-capitalism, psychedelic spirituality. The 1960s don't offer answers, they offer questions. They offer questions, the courage to live without easy ones. Epilogue. The legacy of the storm. We remember the 1960s as chaos, but chaos is just order waiting to be reimagined. Decade didn't fix America, it exposed it. It took the polished facade of the 1950s, the gleaming lawns, the silent dinners, the unspoken rules, and asked, who does this serve? Who does it silence? And what would happen if we stopped pretending? The answers were messy, painful, and necessary. And from that mess emerged not a utopia, but a promise. Isn't inherited, it's demanded. So as the final notes of a change is gonna come fade into the static of a dying radio. We don't mourn the end of the decade. We honor its refusal to look away. Because the 1960s didn't just change history, they taught us that history is ours too, right? The summer that wouldn't end. 1968. If the early 1960s whispered, 1968 screamed. It began not with hope, but with blood. In January, the Tet Offensive shattered the illusion that the war in Vietnam was nearly won. On the nightly news, American soldiers bled in streets they couldn't pronounce, while at home, teenagers burned their draft cards like sacred texts of rebellion. By April, Martin Luther King Jr. was gunshot on a Memphis balcony, still fighting for the dream. Riots erupted in over 100 cities. National Guard troops patrolled streets that just weeks before had echoed with children's laughter and ice cream truck chimes. And then, in June, Robert Kennedy, charismatic, promising, the last flicker of Camelot, was gunned down in a hotel kitchen after winning the California primary. America watched his casket roll down the tracks on a slow train to Arlington, carried by a generation whose faith in justice was being buried with him. The nation didn't just mourn, it unraveled. The children take the streets. The kids who once sat politely at 1950s dinner tables were now knee-deep in tear gas, chanting "The whole world is watching." Outside the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, they weren't just protesting the war. They were rejecting the entire script. No more nuclear families, no more silent women, no more pretending that patriotism meant blind obedience. They wore their hair long not as fashion, but as defiance. They burned brass not to destroy femininity, but to reclaim it. They dropped acid not to escape, but to see, to tear down the walls between self and sky, between truth and propaganda. And when the cops charged with batons, they didn't run, they held hands, they sang. Because by 1968, music wasn't entertainment, it was armor. Nina Simone's Mississippi Goddamn became an anthem. Jimi Hendrix's Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock the following year wouldn't be a performance, it would be an exorcism. Women, stop asking permission. Housewife, who once hid the feminine mystique under her sewing basket, now stood at lecterns, her voice steady, her eyes blazing. No more, she said. No more pretending that happiness lives in a perfectly folded laundry pile. The National Organization for Women Now grew from a handful of women in 1966 to a national force by 1968, demanded equal pay, reproductive freedom, the right to exist outside the domestic theater. And when the media mocked them as hysterical, they laughed sharp, knowing sound that said, "You have no idea what's coming." Meanwhile, in living rooms across America, daughters looked at their mothers and saw not weakness, but warning. "I won't live your silence," they vowed, "not for a casserole, not for a white picket fence, not for anything." The dream fractures but doesn't die after King's death. The civil rights movement splintered. Some clung to nonviolence, others embraced black power fists, raised Afro's proud voices, unapologetic. Black Panther Party opened free breakfast programs for children, while armed with shotguns and revolutionary theory, they weren't just feeding bodies, they were feeding dignity. And America didn't know what to do with a movement that refused to beg. Meanwhile, the anti-war protests grew louder, wilder, more desperate. Students occupied campus buildings, holding signs that read, "Bring my boy home." The government called them unpatriotic. History would call them prophets. The personal becomes the battlefield. By 1968, the kitchen was no longer just a kitchen. It was a war room. Conversations that once swirled around casserole recipes now circled around consciousness. Are you really going to college? Just to find a husband? Why do I have to pretend I don't know what sex is? What if I don't want to be a secretary or a soldier? And in bedrooms, closets, and late-night dorm rooms, another revolution simmered. In June 1969, just months after the chaos of '68, police raided the Stonewall Inn in New York City. But this time, the patrons fought back, not with petitions, not with polite letters, with bricks, fists, and a refusal to be erased. The LGBTQ rights movement, long whispered in shadows, stepped into the light, furious and unbreakable. The legacy of the breaking point, 1968, didn't solve anything. It exposed everything. It showed that peace isn't the absence of conflicts, the presence of justice. That love isn't just feeling, it's a verb. That freedom isn't given, it taken. And though the decade would end not with a solution, but with a question, where do we go from here? It left behind something far more powerful than answers. Courage. The courage to say this is wrong. The courage to stand when everyone else kneels. The courage to build a new world from the ashes of the old. Epilogue. The light. After the storm, we look back on the late 1960s and see chaos. But chaos is just creation in disguise. The 1950s built a fortress of silence. The early 60s cracked its walls. But 1968 kicked the door down. And though the smoke still hung heavy in the air, though the wounds were raw and the future uncertain, something beautiful began to rise. A new America, one not defined by conformity, but by conscience, not by sameness, but by solidarity, not by the dream sold in TV commercials, but by the dream fought for in the streets, the classrooms, the bedrooms, and the basements. It wasn't perfect, it still isn't, but it was honest, and sometimes that's the most revolutionary thing of all. The 1970s, the decade that cleaned up the revolution if the 1960s screamed, the 1970s whispered hoarse, exhausted, but alive. The dream hadn't died, it had just gotten tired. By 1970, the nation was nursing a collective hangover. The streets were quieter, the protests fewer, the headlines less poetic. The war in Vietnam dragged on, but the urgency had dulled into grim endurance. The civil rights movement had won laws, but not hearts. Feminism had cracked the door, but the house was still burning, and the psychedelic promise of universal love, it had mostly given way to the Brady Bunch and polyester leisure suits. But don't mistake fatigue for surrender. The 1970s wasn't a retreat, it was a recalibration. The generation that had burned its draft cards now sat on folding chairs in community centers, registering voters. The women who marched on Washington were now running for school board. The kids who once chanted "Hell no" were now learning to say, "Let's try." This was not the end of idealism. It was idealism grown up. The kitchen table becomes the new front line. The revolution didn't vanish, it moved indoors. In the 1950s, the kitchen was a stage for performance. In the 1960s, it was a backdrop for rebellion. But in the 1970s, the kitchen became a war room. Over coffee brewed in mismatched mugs, no more percolator. Theater mothers debated era ratification while stirring lentil stew. Fathers read Ms. magazine, not because they understood it, but because their daughters left it on the couch. Teenagers argued about Watergate instead of "I Love Lucy." Dinner was no longer a ritual of silence. It was messy, loud, and real. Sometimes someone cried, sometimes someone stormed out, but for the first time, feelings weren't banished to the basement. They were served right alongside the casserole. And the casserole itself had changed. No more canned soup and crushed potato chips. Now it was whole wheat. Tofu, if you were really bold, and a side of earnest conversation about conscious consumption. The personal wasn't just political anymore, it was planetary. The rise of the me decade and the search for meaning. Tom Wolfe called it the me decade, and the label stuck. But it wasn't narcissism, it was necessity. After a decade of giving everything to the cause, marching, burning, bleeding people finally asked, "What about me?" Therapy went mainstream. Not as a last resort, but as self-care. Meditation mats appeared next to the shag carpet. Self-help books replaced party invitations. This wasn't selfishness. It was survival, because you can't heal the world if you're hollow inside. So people turned inward, not to escape, but to regroup. They joined encounter groups. They journaled in loopy script. They bought houseplants and named them after their therapists. And in doing so, they redefined strength. It wasn't just about standing in the streets. It was about sitting with your pain and not looking away. The soundtrack shifts from anthems to introspection. The music softened. Gone were the thunderous chants of "We shall overcome." In their place came the raw, trembling voice of Joni Mitchell singing "I Am a Lonely Painter." James Taylor strumming "Fire and Rain" like a lullaby for a wounded generation. Marvin Gaye asking, "What's going on?" Not as a protest, but as a plea. Even rock got quieter. Fleetwood Mac's "Rumors" wasn't about changing the world. It was about surviving heartbreak in a broken band. And yet it spoke to millions. Because the 1970s understood something the 60s hadn't. You change. The world one healed heart at a time. The unfinished work, of course. The fight wasn't over. In 1972, title Ike's passed giving girls the right to play. but in high schools across America, cheerleaders still got new uniforms, while the girls' basketball team practiced in hand-me-downs. In 1973, Roe v. Wade legalized abortion, but by 1976, states were already chipping away at access disguised as regulation, but rooted in the same old fear and the dream of racial justice. It hit the wall of white flight, redlining, and the quiet, systemic cruelty of colorblind policy. The 1970s didn't solve these things, but it refused to forget them. Veterans formed support groups when the government turned away. Black artists built independent presses when publishers said their stories weren't universal. Gay men and women opened community centers after Stonewall, creating chosen families when blood ones shut the door. This was activism without spotlights, heroism without headlines, and it was just as vital. The aesthetic of imperfection, even the look of the decade, rebelled against the 1950s obsession with polished hair, went natural afros, shags, curls, unstraightened. Clothes were earth-toned, loose, often second-hand. Homes featured macramewood paneling and a defiant lack of plastic slipcovers. Perfection was out. Authenticity was in. You didn't have to look like a catalog to be worthy. You just had to show up as you were. And for the first time, that was enough. Epilogue. The quiet continuation. The 1970s didn't end with a bang or a song. It ended with a sigh of relief and a deep breath before the next leap. It was the decade that taught America how to live after the revolution, how to tend the garden you'd fought so hard to plant, how to forgive yourself for being tired, how to keep going, even when the dream feels distant. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't loud, but it was honest, and in a world that had spent 2 decades either performing or protesting, honesty was the most radical act of all. Welcome to the 1980s, where optimism wore power suits and everything was for sale. The 1950s sold a dream of order, and the 1960s burned it down to build something truer. And the 1970s tried to sweep up the pieces with a broom made of patchouli and polyester. Then the 1980s looked at the whole mess and said, "Forget healing the world. Let's just look amazing while we monetize it." This wasn't a decade, it was a rebrand, and America was ready for it. The rise of the self-made myth after the malaise of the 70s, the oil crises, the Watergate hangover, the sense that maybe the American dream had expired like a can of tuna left in the fallout. Shelter people were hungry for a story they could believe in again. Enter the hero of the self. No more collective movements, no more we. Now it was me, my portfolio, and my mirrored sunglasses. Ronald Reagan didn't just become president, he became the narrator of a new national fairy tale. If you work hard, play by the rules, and buy the right blazer, you, too, can be rich, happy, and perpetually tanned under studio lighting. Success wasn't about justice anymore. It was about aesthetic. You didn't just want a house. You wanted a McMansion with a 2-story foyer and a jacuzzi that whispered, "I survived the recession and won." You didn't just want a Jabu. Wanted a corner office, a gold-plated Rolodex, and the ability to say synergy without flinching. And if you failed, well, that was on you. Because in the 1980s, poverty wasn't systemic, it was a lifestyle choice. The soundtrack of ambition music didn't soothe anymore. It motivated. Madonna didn't just sing, she strategized, turning sexuality into a corporate ladder. Michael Jackson didn't just dance, he levitated, then owned the publishing rights to the Beatles. Catalogued by lunchtime, every anthem was a battle cry for upward mobility. Money for nothing. Girls just want to have fun. Translation. And also a convertible. Eye of the Tiger. The unofficial theme of anyone who'd ever done a single push-up and thought, I'm basically Rocky. Even love songs got a performance review. I want a new drug, sang Huey Lewis, not because he was lost, but because he was shopping for one. And in living rooms across America, kids weren't just watching MTV, they were auditioning for it, practicing their hair flips and lip-syncing into hairbrushes like it was a rehearsal for Empire. The home as a stage for success, the kitchen, was no longer a site of quiet endurance. It was a showroom. Granite countertops, stainless steel, everything. A microwave that cost more than your grandparents' first car. Casseroles were out. Quiche was in-served on stoneware, so expensive you were afraid to eat off it. And forget Tupperware parties. Now you hosted wine tastings even, if you couldn't tell. Merlot from grape juice, because sophistication wasn't about knowledge, it was about performing it upstairs. The master bedroom became a sanctuary of self-care, king-sized, with a mirrored ceiling for reasons and a bathroom so big it had its own zip code. Children's rooms, they were brand extensions. He-Man sheets, Care Bear lamps, Nintendo tucked beside the bed like a sacred relic, because in the 1980s, even your childhood came with merchandise. The family rebooted. The nuclear family made a comeback, but this time it had upgrades. Dad wasn't just a provider. He was a yuppie, commuting in a BMW with a briefcase full of stock tips and regret. Mom. She was back in the workforce, but now she wore shoulder pads so wide they could legally qualify as parking spaces. She dropped the kids at daycare, closed a merger by noon, and still made it home in time to microwave a Stuffer's lasagna that tasted like victory.